Hello, welcome back. This is the book of History of Modern India by Bipin Chandra. Today I am going to part, the third chapter of this book, European penetration and the British conquest of India. So let's start the third chapter, European penetration and the British conquest of India. The first part of this chapter is a new phase in European Eastern trade. The second part is the growth of the East India Company's trade and influence. Third part is influence, that is 1600 to 1714. Then third part is the Anglo-French struggle in South India. Fourth part is British occupation of Bengal. Then dual system of administration of Bengal and wars under Warren Hastings 1772 to 85 and Cornwallis. Then expansion under Lord Wellesley and expansion under Lord Hastings. So and then the consolidation of British power 1818 to 1857. So let's start the third chapter. This is the third chapter, European penetration and British conquest of India. India's trade relation with European go back to ancient days of the Greeks. During the Middle Ages, trade between Europe and India and Southeast Asia was carried on along several routes. The Asian part of the trade was carried on mostly by Arab merchants and sellers, while the Mediterranean and European part was the virtual monopoly of the Italians. Goods from Asia to Europe passed through many states and many hands, yet trade remained highly profitable. So, firstly, the trade was doing through the land route, and they have to cross so many countries to trade with India, right? While the Mediterranean and the European part was the virtual monopoly of the Italians. Goods from Asia to Europe passed through many states and many hands, right? The old trading routes between the east and west came under Turkish control after the Ottoman conquest of Asia Minor and the capture of Constantinople in 1453. Moreover, the merchants of Venice and Geneva monopolized the trade between Europe and Asia and refused to let the new nation states of Western Europe, particularly Spain and Portugal, have any share in the trade through these old routes. The West European states and merchants therefore began to search for new and safer sea route to India and the Spice Islands in Indonesia, then known as East Indies. They wanted to break the Arab and Venetian trade monopolies, bypass Turkish hostility, and open direct trade relations with the East. They were well equipped to do so, as great advances in shipbuilding and the science of navigation had taken place during the 15th century. Moreover, the Renaissance generated a great spirit of adventure among the people of Western Europe. The first steps were taken by Portugal. Okay? The first step was taken by Portugal and Spain, whose seamen, sponsored and controlled by their government, began a great era of geographical discoveries. In 1492, Columbus of Spain, Columbus was from Spain, set out to reach India and discovered America. Instead of India, he discovered America. In 1498, Vasco da Gama of Portugal. So Columbus was from Spain and Vasco da Gama was from Portugal. In 1498, he discovered a new and all sea route from Europe to India. He sailed around Africa via the Cape of Good Hope and reached Calicut. He returned with a cargo which sold for 60 times the cost of his voyage. These and other navigational discoveries opened a new chapter in the history of the world. The 17th and 18th century were to witness all enormous increase in world trade. The vast new continent of America was opened to Europe, and relations between Europe and Asia were completely transformed. Another major source of early capital accumulation or enrichment of European countries was their penetration of Africa in the middle of the 15th century. In the beginning, the gold and ivory of Africa had attracted the foreigner. Very soon, however, trade with Africa centered around the slave trade. Slave trade was the important thing. In the 16th century, the trade was a monopoly of Spain and Portugal. Later, it was dominated by Dutch, French, British merchants. Year after year, particularly after 1650, thousands of Africans were sold as slaves in the West Indies and South America. The slave ships carried manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, exchanged them on the coast of Africa for African slaves, took these slaves across the Atlantic and exchanged them for the colonial produce of plantations or mines, and finally brought back and sold this produce in Europe. It was on the immense profit of this triangular trade that the commercial supremacy of England and France was to be based. A great deal of West European and North American prosperity was based on the slave trade and the plantation worked by slave labor. Moreover, the profits of slave trade and the slave work plantations provides some of the capital which financed the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th century. Similar role was later played by the wealth extracted from India. In the 16th century, European merchants in the 16th century, European merchants and soldiers also began to long process of first penetrating and then subjecting Asian lands to their control. Portugal had a monopoly over the highly profitable eastern trade nearly a century. In India, Portugal established its trading settlement at Cochin, Goa, Diu, and Daman. First, Portugal settled in these places of India. What are these places? Cochin, Goa, Diu, and Daman. Goa, Diu, and Daman. From the beginning, the Portuguese combined the use of force. They used the force with trade. In this, they were helped by the superiority of their armed ships, which enabled them to dominate the seas. A handful of Portuguese soldiers could maintain their position on the seas against the much more powerful land powers of India and Asia. By threatening Mughal shipping, they also succeeded in securing many trading concessions from the Mughal emperors. Under the viceroyalty of Alfonso de Albuquerque, who captured Goa. Alfonso de Albuquerque, who captured Goa in 1510. The Portuguese established their domination over the entire Asian coast, from Hormuz in the Persian Gulf to Malacca in Malaya. In the Spice Islands in Indonesia, they seized Indian territories on the coast and waged constant war to expand their trade and dominions and safeguard their trade monopoly from their European rivals. Nor did they shy away from piracy and plunder. They also indulged in inhuman cruelties and lawlessness. In spite of their barbaric behavior, their possessions in India survived for a century because they enjoyed control over the high seas. Their soldiers and administrators maintained strict discipline and they did not have to face the might of the Mughal Empire as South India was outside Mughal influence. In the latter half of the 16th century, England and Holland and later France, all growing commercial and naval power, waged a fierce struggle against the Spanish and Portuguese monopoly over world trade. In this struggle, the latter had to go under. The English and Dutch merchants were now able to use the Cape of Good Hope route to India and so join in the race for empire in the east. In the end, the Dutch gained control over Indonesia and British over India, Sri Lanka, and Malay. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company was formed and the Dutch States General, the Dutch Parliament, gave it a charter empowering it to make war, conclude treaties, acquire territories, and build fortresses. The main interest of Dutch lay not in India but in the Indonesian islands of Java, Sumatra, and the Spice Islands, where spices were produced. They soon turned out to Portuguese from Malaya Straits and the Indonesia islands, and in 1623 defeated English attempts to establish themselves there. So Dutch East India Company was formed in 1602. इसको याद रखना. Then in 1623 they defeated English attempt to establish themselves there. They also established trading depots at Surat, Broch, Cambay, and Ahmedabad in Gujarat in West India, Cochin in Kerala, Nagapattinam in Madras, Masulipattnam in Andhra, Chinsura in Bengal, Patna in Bihar, Agra in Uttar Pradesh. In 1658, they also conquered Sri Lanka from the Portuguese. This is the map of India, where the Dutch East India Company settled its rule. This is the Masulipattnam in Andhra. This is the Masulipattnam, Diu, Daman. This is the Cochin in Kerala. These are the places where Dutch East India Company settled their rule. The English merchants looked greedily at the Asian trade. Now time for English East India Company. British East India Company. The success of the Portuguese, the rich cargoes of spices, calicoes, silk, gold, pearls, drug, porcelain, and ebony they carried, and the high profit they made inflamed the imagination of the merchants. of England and made them impatient to participate in such profitable commerce. An English association or company to trade with the East was formed in 1599 under the auspice of a group of merchants known as the Merchant Adventurers, the company popularly known as the East India Company. So in 1599, British East India Company was established. The company, popularly known as the East India Company, was granted a royal charter and the exclusive privilege to trade in East by Queen Elizabeth on 31st December 1600. In 1608, it decided to open a factory, the name given at the time of trading depot at Surat, the west coast of India, and sent Captain Hawkins to Jahangir's court to obtain royal favours. Consequently, the English company was given permission by a royal firman to open factories at several places on the west coast. The English were not satisfied with this concession. In 1615, their ambassador Sir Thomas Roy reached the Mughal court. Roy succeeded in getting an imperial firman to trade and establish factories in all parts of the Mughal Empire. In 1662, the Portuguese gave the island of Bombay to King Charles II of England as dowry for marrying a Portuguese princess. So, how clever they are. The place was India and they give them it as a dowry. Island of Bombay. This place was given to the King Charles II of England by the Portuguese. Okay. Eventually, the Portuguese lost all their possessions in India except Goa, Diu, and Daman. The English company fell out with the Dutch company over the division of the spice trade of the Indonesian islands. The intermittent war in India between the two powers, which had begun in 1654, ended in 1667 when the English gave up all claims to Indonesia while the Dutch agreed to leave alone the English settlement in India. So this was the first part of the chapter 3, a new phase in Europe's eastern trade. So this part is about how the first Portuguese Vasco da Gama discovered the route to India, and then how the Dutch East India Company entered in India. The name of the discoverer was Vasco da Gama. He discovered the route in 1498 to India, and then they entered the east part. Then the Dutch East India Company was Portuguese in 1510. Portuguese established their dominance over the entire Asian coast. 1510. Then Dutch came to India in 1602. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company was formed, and Dutch State General, the Dutch Parliament, gave it a charter empowering it to make war. Then, finally, the East India Company of English people, the British East India Company was formed in 1599, and they came to India, and they established a factory in 1608 at Surat. This is the first entry of the European countries to India. So this was the first part of the third chapter, European penetration and the British conquest. Thank you.